All right. What's really pleasing about what Jenny said was that some of the activities that you've got planned coming forward is excellent to see, because that's how the table grape industry started. So what I'd like to do today is just give you an overview of the table grape industry itself, where we've come from and where we are now in terms of exports. So the industry itself, we have become Australia's largest fresh fruit exporter by value, and that's taken probably 10 years to achieve. We have about 900 growers Australia-wide. We grow grapes in every state in Australia except for Tasmania. We have about 25,000 hectares planted of vineyards, and our harvest season runs from November through to May. If you look at our export growth at a glance, the ATGA was formed in 2002, but our industry obviously has been going a lot longer than that. In fact, we're exporting probably back in the 80s to countries like Indonesia, but very small. 2005, I came on board as a CEO, and my charter was to increase our export growth because we knew that we had saturated the domestic market and there was a lot of potential for a lot of growth in our industry, so we needed somewhere for our grapes to go. The only place it could go was to export. In 2010, we'd gone from $50 million in 2005 to $80 million and 30,000 tonnes. We started then to gain market access, so it took us 5 or 6 years to get access into China, Japan, Korea, improved access into Vietnam and so on. 5 years later, from 2010 to 2015, we'd gone to $240 million worth of exports, 84,000 tonne. And then at our peak, 5 years later, 2020, $623 million worth of exports and 152,000 tonnes. So it's a massive increase in terms of exports. And personally, I give a lot of credit to the growers because they've been on a very strong educational process, but they've grasped that and they've reaped the rewards. So we have about 900 growers throughout Australia. But when I say 900 growers, that's how many growers there are. But in terms of family businesses, there's probably about 500, and we have a lot of father, sons, and so on. So when I say nearly all family businesses, we don't have any corporate businesses in table grapes. We have maybe one or two. They've only just come onto the scene now. They've bought some farms, but primarily we are all family farmers. And all those family farmers, they're probably now second, third, fourth generation, primarily Italian growers, but there are other growers, but they have that work ethic to really put their heart and soul into growing good quality grapes. As well as that, they also, because they're family farmers, they have their own infrastructure. They have their own packing sheds, they have their own cool rooms, they have their own, most of them have their own onshore cold treatment facilities, some of them even have fumigation facilities. So they've basically built up their infrastructure geared up for exports. In terms of our growing regions, we grow grapes, as I said, right through all of Australia. Queensland, Mareeba, Mundubbera, St George and Emerald. New South Wales are in the Euston Riverina area. 75% of production comes from the Sunraysia region, and that's where 99% of our exports come from also. Riverland and in Western Australia, we're down south, and we're also in Swan Valley, Carnarvon, Alice Springs, and Tea Tree. But even in Western Australia now, we're growing grapes up as far as Broome. So let me give you a quick overview of our exports. Here's a graph now that basically shows you our export growth over the 10 years. We've had a 300% growth in exports in 10 years, which is quite phenomenal. As well as that, our unit value and the return to the growers has increased dramatically as well, and it's far exceeded what they got from a domestic return. Gaining new access into countries like China, Japan, Korea, improved access, as I said, to Vietnam, Thailand and so on has also helped improve our market access. In the last we reached that peak there in 2020, that's the big tall green line you see there. In the last 2 years, we've been impacted by COVID quite significantly, and also political pressures, as I'll show you later. But we've had to diversify. So let me just concentrate on a few countries. First of all, China. China's an interesting story, which I'll give you a bit more information in a minute, but basically we gained access in 2011. And basically it was the end of the season, we didn't send any containers there. In the first year, we sent about 300 containers, it's in 2012-13, and growers were basically complacent. They were just basically exporting like they were doing to their domestic market. They weren't paying any due diligence to things like protocol conditions, pest and disease concern and so on, and we were suspended. And I'll say this today that that is the best thing that ever happened to our industry, being suspended. From then, we basically then got back into the market under strict conditions, but I'll show that shortly. And as you can see there, the growth into China has been very substantial. It reached the peak of 62,000 tonnes in 1920. Last 2 years, geopolitical aspects and COVID has hit China fairly bad, and we need to diversify. But at our peak, China took 42% of our exports, so we were highly exposed to one country, and that was a major concern. It always was a concern, even prior to COVID, even prior to the geopolitical issues. So it was about nearly $300 million worth of exports were going to one country. Indonesia is our second biggest market. And again, this is very a volatile country. Whilst we send a lot of grapes there, there is political issues, particularly from the point of view that Indonesia require all their importers to get licences, and then they are required to get quotas. And in the 2019-20 year, there was political issues happening in Indonesia where there's a bit of, for a better way to say it, a bit of biasness towards who got the licences, who got the quotas, and that sort of curtailed our exports a fair bit because it went to maybe 1 or 2 people only. Vietnam, again, was like Indonesia. There is some issues there at times. They did suspend Australian trade in 2014, but we were lucky to gain access again there quite quickly. But it took a while then to rebuild up our exports back to Indonesia. But pleasingly, for this year, we've had a 100% increase on the previous year, and that's in the face of COVID. So we're very, really pleased with the way Indonesia has been happening. Sorry, that was Vietnam. The other thing about, sorry, that's the graph there. We got suspension, and then we've increased our exports for this year. The other pleasing thing about Vietnam is that Australian grapes have about 50% footprint of the market share, which is quite pleasing for an Asian country, because normally that's dominated by Chile and Peru and South Africa, but at least a country like Vietnam recognises Australian grapes and basically is one of our better markets. Japan is another success story. From the point of view that when we gained access, it only took us about 3 or 4 years to get to about $50 million worth of exports. But the interesting thing about Japan is that they accept access by varietal access only. So we're only allowed to send 3 varieties to Japan, of which we only ship 2 varieties. Now that was fine to gain access into that, and it costs a lot of money to go to Japan because you've got to do verification and cold treatment trials. But what we're finding now with Japan is that we're a little bit tired of just receiving 2 varieties, particularly when other countries are sending all these new table grape varieties, and they're basically really screaming out, for the way to describe it, of getting Australians new varieties. And we're losing a little bit of market share there because of that. But pleasingly, at the last BILATS that was just happened maybe a couple of months ago in Japan have basically said through their importers, which is a bit unusual for Japan because they're really very much a mature country and they don't want to influence their government, but their importers basically insisted on Japan MAF that the next priority for them would be for Australian table grapes, all varieties. So hopefully we'll get access to all varieties to Japan by the end of 2023. South Korea is an interesting country as well, from the point of view that they have very strong protocol conditions. They send inspectors out to inspect the fruit pre-shipment. We've been able to eliminate them because of our compliance record, but it was a very, very slow start into Korea, primarily because consumers buy by sight, not by taste. And Chile dominates that market, and their grapes are very, very dark green and very firm. And our grapes, when we get sweet, become slightly amber yellow in colour and far more tasting than, say, the Korean grapes. However, the consumers thought that our grapes were old and tired when they saw the sight of them. So it took a while to actually break into that market. We did have inspectors coming out, as I mentioned. That tall graph that you see there was the last year pre-COVID, and last year we had the inspectors. In fact, the last day that those inspectors were here before they were called back by the government because of COVID, they actually inspected 56 containers in the one day to send to Korea. So they basically had a lot of work to do. The Philippines is another emerging market for us. It's an expanding market. A lot of these countries, a lot of our growers place a lot of emphasis on your countries like your Indonesias, your Chinas, your Japans and so on, and a lot of other countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. We didn't put a lot of due diligence into, but we're now doing that, and we're finding that we're reaping the rewards of that. And as you can see there, even with COVID affected the last 2 years, we've maintained our market share into the Philippines. Thailand is another country where we want to put more effort into, and we've done that in the last 2 or 3 years because of our promotional activities and of also our relationships that we've built with retailers and so on over in Thailand. So we're increasing our exports there. At the same time, we're improving our relationships and promotional activity. So let me now talk about the support that we have given our growers to improve our exports. Market intelligence. I can't emphasise enough about market intelligence to our growers. We certainly took a focus on Asia. One of the reasons why we went to Asia is because we had they've got a healthy GDP growth. They're rapidly expanding middle class. Populations are moving into the cities, so therefore we've got an opportunity to just focus on the major towns rather than trying to go out to the second, third tier cities in terms of trying to improve our exports. A lot of Asian countries don't trust their own food, particularly China. I mean, there's been a lot of issues, as you know, with a lot of, say, milk powder and so on. And they see imported goods as a luxury, particularly Australian fruit. Australia has a great reputation and they want Australian fruit. So we capitalised on that with all the Asian countries, and that's the sort of work that we did in terms of providing that information back to our growers. Just going back to China now, as I mentioned before, it was the best thing that happened to our industry when we got suspended. So we got suspended 1 year after gaining access. China would send out inspectors. We had 16 inspectors out at one stage in our country inspecting all of the containers prior to going to China. In that first year that we exported, 1 in 3 containers were rejected. So that's a 33% rejection rate. China did have difficult quarantine conditions, admittedly, but there was obviously a strong need that basically the industry needed to take stock. And so if we're going to take this export seriously, not only did the growers need to improve, but we also needed to provide a lot of technical support to China for the growers to go to China. So eventually when we renegotiated our access, we relented to China's strong demands. We were the first country that China allowed to pack in the field, pick and pack in the field. China demanded that we go back into the shed. And we also instigated a pre-inspection prior to the Chinese inspection. So the inspectors were still coming out. And this, if you like, was the forerunner to the authorised officer regime that Australia implies now. So we either had a government officer or an industry respected person inspect the consignments prior to the official Chinese inspection. So we're trying to cover our bases to make sure that if we found something, we would reject the consignment prior to the Chinese rejecting it, and that would improve our compliance record. And that, as I said, started the authorised officer. And as well as that, there was a massive education program that we undertook with all our growers. So we had workshop after workshop trying to improve the attitude and the information and knowledge for our growers. Some other critical support that we gave to our growers is that we improved their pest and disease monitoring and training. There was a lot of workshops held. Admittedly, they were lecture style back then, but we held 3 or 4 of them prior to every season. We reinforced our pest control measures. We certainly reinforced again our packing house procedures, particularly for China, and a lot of growers had to put some infrastructure into their sheds to make sure that their packing house procedures comply with China requirements. Market intelligence. There was an enormous amount of market intelligence provided to our growers, not just from China, but for every country, which involved obviously cultural practices, and we encouraged trade missions where we took a lot of growers overseas to meet with importers, retailers, etc. The other thing that we had to do was to monitor our reputation, and particularly to overseas countries, but reinforce that to growers. In terms of agri-chemical access, there's a lot of chemicals that have been taken away. There wasn't too many replacements. Some growers were using some chemicals they shouldn't have, and that was a big concern to our industry. So we needed to improve on that. So there's MRL advice was provided. Residue testing, we wanted our growers to do residue testing before sending out consignments overseas. Data analysis, we provided a lot of data analysis on various countries in terms of their exports receivable from various other countries, etc., and where we stood in the program. And the other thing that Jenny talked about was our maturity program. We commenced our maturity program about 6 years ago, and we basically did a lot of analysis, pre-farm testing, on-farm testing, supermarket testing, DC testing from retailers, etc., to the point where we developed a national maturity standard where all growers must adhere to that now, and they do, and that's improved our quality. The other critical support we provided was, and this was in conjunction with Citrus, where we were giving, as I said before, lectures on pest monitoring and so on, but eventually we put that online through the Tocal College, and now all industries are doing this. But the online training is there, it's mandatory, it needs to be completed and passed so that all grow up before they can export. And a lot of our growers use agronomists, and they were involved in that as well. So that's another support that we did. And then we got onto our export registration. And that was a major drama for us because with our export registration, it was done manually to start with. The requirement for the protocols is you had to provide maps and you had to identify each variety within those blocks within the farms and so on. And we would get things like set out Google Earth maps to nice drawings to even crayon drawings. And then we had to write on them, and it was just a nightmare. So we developed an online registration system. And when you consider that we've got, as I mentioned before, about 500 registrations, that's grower registrations, as well as that we have to register our packing sheds. There's about 480 of them, given the fact that most growers have got their own packing sheds. And when you look at individual blocks, we basically have over 4,000 individual export registrations that we have to monitor and assess to make sure they're accurate for exporting. Hence the reason why we've developed this export registration system, which does geospatial mapping, and it actually identifies all the blocks, as you can see there, and numbers the blocks and puts in the varieties, calculates the size of the hectares, puts in their traps, and basically the growers end up with a system where it's linked to the Department of Agriculture. They use the system to actually audit all the growers, and they accredit them accordingly, and the growers can see where, which country they've applied for and which countries they've been accredited for. If they're suspended for whatever reason, because it may be pest disease exposure, one of those greens will turn red, so the growers can see at any stage where they've been approved and accredited. And the other thing that we've done with our system now is that with pest monitoring, which they're required to do every fortnight, previously, they'd be walking through their farmyards, vineyards, and they would be just recording it down on a piece of paper. They'd have to record and produce that at audits and so on. They can now, through using mobile apps, using their smartphones or tablets, they can actually walk through their farms, and in real time, they can do their pest monitoring, and it's uploaded to the system immediately. And the audit department through DAF can actually see that straight away and make sure that they're doing it and complying. Compliance is another big thing where the government in the last 5 or 6 years has become very strict on compliance for exporting. You've got to make sure that the growers are totally aware of their protocol conditions. Traceability system is another thing that we've introduced, so we can actually trace the product from the vineyard, right from the vine, all the way through the supply chain, right into the consumer's hands, and even at the end there with its barcodes there on the packaging. The consumer in, say, Japan, New Zealand, Korea, China, can actually scan on that barcode and they'll get information right back to where that farm was, where those grapes were picked from, etc. So that traceability system is now in play. There's been staff records, training for staff records, farm procedures, standard operating procedures, picking, packing, pack house, etc. All that has been provided, training and education to our growers. We've provided templates to them. And all that has given the grower the ability now to confidently pass the government audits as they happen every year. The other phase that we've done is developing the markets. It's fine to get the growers on board, and to get market access, but we need to develop the markets as well. So one of the things that we have encouraged our growers to do is to build up strong networks and relationships with our retailers, importers and distributors overseas. So we've encouraged them, and we've basically, not enforced, but we've basically said a lot of times, if you want to go to certain countries, you need to come with us overseas, you need to meet the importers, you need to meet the retailers, and you need to form that relationship with them. And by doing that, Asians like that. They like that face-to-face contact, they like that networking, and it has developed that strong commercial relationship, which has enhanced our exports. As well, we've given them a lot of market intelligence on what each country wants. So if you were to ask me, if you're going to go to Thailand, you're going to go to Vietnam, Korea, etc., what varieties, what size, what colour, what maturity, every grower will be able to tell you that, as because we've reinforced that into them, so they know exactly what they're picking and packing for and where to send their grapes to for each country. We've organised trade seminars in country. We've done, last year, because of COVID, we did it virtually, but we did 7 countries last year: Japan, Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. We would spend probably 2 hours talking to the major importers, retailers, distributors in those countries every year collectively. Prior to COVID, it was done face-to-face. We'd get them all in the one room together, similar to this, and all the major people were there from that country, and we would give a presentation on our industry. We would provide them with the upcoming season in terms of the quality, the varieties, the timings, etc. And with that, we would also have maybe 10 to 15 major exporters with us, and they would then sit one-to-one with them afterwards for maybe 3 to 4 hours, developing those relationships, developing commercial sales. Some of the promotional activities that we do, the table grape industry spends probably $1 million every year on exports, on promotional work, and we go to every country. And where possible, we use the in-house facilities through Austrade and things like that. With Korea, because we try to reinforce the fact that our grapes were sweet when they turned slightly yellow, we engaged the Korean ambassador at the time, and he was very supportive in terms of the activities that we do. That was the online activities that we did this year. But for every country, we do massive in-store displays during our peak period of when we're landing fruit into that country. These are going through the Thailand, Philippines, Korean, China, etc. of our market access. So that's the success story, but it comes with some risks. And some of those risks, phytosanitary breaches. We've got to be very mindful and we reinforce always to our growers about adhering to the protocols and ensuring that they don't do anything out of the ordinary and pose phytosanitary breaches, such as sending over boxes of fruit that might have contaminations in them, might contain some pest or disease, etc. That always coincides with food safety risks. We've got political risks, as I mentioned, with China now. We've got Indonesia, Vietnam. So a lot of countries, if you go over there and say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, who knows where it could end up. Currency fluctuations obviously plays a part in terms of the return to the growers. And then there's MRL violations. And MRL violations is the major risk that we face right now because of the chemical use and with the chemicals being taken away. So what we did to do that is that we, as Jenny mentioned, the ATGA, the table grape industry, developed an MRL app. So we did have all the MRL information available. It was on our website. It was in a spreadsheet form. And if you growers in this room now, I'm sure you probably dislike being in the field, running back to your office, downloading your website, going to the website, downloading a spreadsheet and trying to look up and trying to find an MRL for a chemical or for a country that you're going to go to. So using the modern technology, we developed this MRL app, which I'm pleased to say, we've now rolled this out to 7 other industries, of which berries is one. So just a quick process of how the app works. You log in with a username and password. You can then select your crop, whether it be blueberries, raspberries or strawberries. Then you can either choose by active constituent or by country. In this case here, by the slide, we've chosen by by active constituent, and it'll come up with all the active constituents, so you just click on which one it is on the list there. So with that list, we've selected Carb. I think that's how you pronounce it. So when we select that, then you'll see it'll come up with the countries, the MRLs, and the withholding periods. Or you can go back and select by country. So if you know you're going to export to, say, India, or in this case, Thailand, you can select just Thailand. You can then select the issue that you might have. So if you've got, in this case, we've selected botrytis and grey mould. When you select that, it'll come up with, for Thailand, what active constituents you can actually apply on that pest or disease, and it'll then give you the withholding period and the MRL as well. Or you can go back and you can then go back and look at your past searches if you've done that previously. So that app is now available. There is a disclaimer on the app, and then the accuracy of that app is as at the time, and it involves people like Jenny to ensure that any changes occurring to MRLs are uploaded and updated. So we do put that disclaimer in there, but we also ask if you think the app is inaccurate to talk to Jenny, and we can change the app in 10 seconds. It's that easy to do, but we need that accurate information first. MRLs are changing all the time by different countries, so it's important that information gets provided through to you. So finally, some take-home messages. There are 3 pillars to market or to export. There's market access, market development, and market promotions. Jenny talked about berry industries getting a lot of market access applications in. They need to be put in there. Once those applications are in, if they're approved through the Hort Innovation Committee, they then go through to the government for prioritisation. But that's the first step. But even prior to doing that, you need to get all your ducks in order to make sure that if you were to gain market access tomorrow, you've got everything ready to go and you can export. So you can't put an application in, then you've got to do all your work, etc. All that's got to be pre-done. Market development, as I talked about, even prior to getting market access, you can still start developing your market. With Toba grapes, prior to getting Japan, Korea, etc., we were over there 2-3 years prior to getting access, and we were talking to all the importers, retailers, distributors. We started to build those relationships. And then you've got market promotions. There's ongoing education for the growers and market intelligence. Again, I can't stress the importance of that. Find the information out. If you're going to go to which country, what size, what varieties, what's the maturity level like, etc. Get that information and make sure that all the growers have got that understanding. Build ongoing relationships and continue to maintain them. The issue that Toba grapes have at the moment, because of COVID, is that we haven't been able to travel for 2 years because of COVID. We're now reinstituting that, where we're going to India in a couple of weeks, then we're going to Singapore, we'll be going to Vietnam, Korea, Japan, all before our next harvest season, to rebuild those connections, to rebuild those relationships, and to commence that commercial transactions again. Promotional activities, as I said, we spend close to $1 million every year on promotional activities. That's required if you want to maintain and build your support the growth. And the final thing that I'll say, which is extremely important, and it's based on the Australian reputation, and that is quality, quality, quality. The better fruit that you send over to overseas countries, the better return you're going to get, and it's going to benefit not only the domestic industry, but it's also going to benefit you. And that's what we've done in Toba grapes. Our domestic industry has improved in price through our strength in exports, but it's all due to quality. So, thank you.